this bodes well in that you would think that they would try to gloss over some of those things. That these people betrayed Jesus, that they denied Jesus, that they all ran away and they hid. Meanwhile, the women are like, and so we have a number of individuals like this, Irenaeus, Polycarp, Papias. And so they give us this unanimous confirmation within this early community, because it's not a very big community at this point, in saying, okay, well, we know who the authors of the Gospels are, and we have this direct chain of custody paper trail that goes back to the earliest Jesus community. And one of the criteria for deciding, okay, well, what goes in this group of documents, this testamentum, right? That's the word we get. So it's actually the word covenant. So in Greek, the word testament is diatheke, which is covenant. So it's the Old Covenant, New Covenant. In Latin, it's testamentum. So that's where we get Old Testament, New Testament. And they say, well, we know who the earliest Jesus community were. We know who were the disciples of Jesus. We know who the disciples of Jesus were. And so we can trace these back. So when other Gospels pop up, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, and they're analyzed, they know the people who are connected with this community. So they can look at the Gospel of Thomas and say, this isn't from Thomas. A, because we know people who know Thomas, and B, the content in it doesn't reflect anything accurate in its representation of either who the disciples were or who the Jesus who we know and have known from this community to be. And so when I talk about unanimous agreement on the Gospels, I'm talking about the earliest Jesus community that actually had a direct succession from either someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus. So we have this unanimous agreement on the Gospels, and we have this unanimous agreement on the letters of Paul, but we have some disagreement about some of the other books. If for no other reason, then there are a lot of books floating around with very distinct names on them.
Like the Book of Enoch, are you talking about? Like stuff like that?
No, that's actually previous. We can talk about that if you want.
Yeah. Well, let's not get you off topic, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah, so there are a lot of letters and writings with names associated with John and Peter. And so you have, we have a
common name.
Yeah, right. Well, you have the Gospel of John, but then you have 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then you have the Acts of John, and you have the Revelation of John, and you have the Epistles of John. Like, you have to figure this out.
Yeah.
So there are some books where the church is like, okay, 24 of the 27, we can say we know where these come from. But we got to make sure we do our due diligence so that we're not recognizing books that are not an accurate representation of the actual authors. And so that's why it took the dust to settle a little bit more on 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, and James. Because they're like, we got to make sure these books are actually connected to the people whose names.
How did they do that?
The same way they did it with the other ones. So they looked back and looked at both the content and the provenance of the actual documents. So where are they being written? Who can we connect them with? Where are these documents coming from? And what communities are they coming out of? So there was no actual criteria for canonicity, but they did ask questions. And so these are in scholarship sometimes referred to as apostolicity, which is, does it have a connection with an apostle or someone who knew an apostle? Orthodoxy, which has nothing to do with the Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church. Orthos means right, and doxa means, in a number of its different semantic ranges, teaching. So orthodoxy means, does it reflect the right teaching in that the apostles established churches, and they've been teaching in the churches the things that have been handed down from those who Jesus gave the authority to teach. And so when we look at some of the content of these things, so for example, the last line of the Gospel of Thomas has Peter looking at Jesus and saying, hey, Mary's here. Get Mary out because women are not worthy of life. And so Jesus says, don't worry, I'm going to make her into a male that resembles you, male. And the last line of the Gospel of Thomas is, every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.
Like transgenderism?
So I'm
fucking with
it's complicated, right? They were before their time, right? So the early church looked at this kind of content and they went, what is this?
Yeah.
Like, that's not, we know what the teaching of Jesus sounds like. it ain't that. And so they would both look at the content and look at the provenance in terms of the actual communities that they were coming out of. So you had apostolicity and you had orthodoxy, and then you also had the third criteria, which was Catholicity. Once again, nothing to do with Roman Catholics. Kata means concerning, and holos means the whole. Concerning the whole, universal church. And so they're saying, okay, is there enough unanimous agreement from the church universal, from the churches that were established by the apostles, that we can say these are being read widely within church communities that actually reflect a provenance of going back to the earliest Jesus community?
Right. Within those communities, though, but the thing I always worry about, and to be fair, I worry about this with everything. It's not just, we happen to be talking about Christianity right now, but I'd make the same argument for, or raise the same possibility, I should say, for literally anything that points to any form of religion or historical understanding of the history of the world. Like when you have call it closed-end community, you have a handful of people who are left behind after Jesus, who knew him, who are to carry on his word as he wanted, as he would have wanted it. You have to understand that even if they may have been really stand-up people and done a good job, there's still a human bias that occurs where it's like, well, I'll take that, I'll take that.
Sure.
He wouldn't have minded, right? That could still happen, no?
Yeah. No, and I think that's a good observation from a lay perspective and from a historical perspective.
Yeah.
And one thing that's very unique about some of these documents is there's a criteria within historiography that's referred to as the criterion of embarrassment. And so the idea is if there is something within the writing that reflects very poorly on either the authors or the people connected with the authors, it is a good assumption to say that it is probably true. Not that it's always true, but that it's probably true because you're not going to put your, right, this is what we were talking earlier about some of the perspectives of prophethood in Islam versus Christianity. My Muslim friends have a problem with the prophets looking as bad as they do in the Old Testament. Because they're like, a representation of a man of God wouldn't look like that.
And you and I were talking off camera about this earlier. Muslims view prophets as like a form of divine, like a form of relative perfection.
Or at least there's an understanding within, say, Sunni orthodoxy that I don't think it's not all Muslims, but sort of historical Sunni orthodoxy within Islam would largely have an understanding of prophets being close to sinless, if not sinless. And so if you have someone like King David, who in the Bible, he's a murderer, he's an adulterer, he sleeps with Bathsheba, and then Bathsheba's husband comes back from war.
Is this the same David with Goliath?
Yeah.
Well, he did kill Goliath.
He killed Goliath, but that was a good move, right? Yeah. So he kills Goliath, he goes on, he's a great king, but he always has this problem of he just loves the ladies too much. Right?
Nothing wrong with that.
So the story is he's standing on the roof. He sees Bathsheba. She's on her roof and she's bathing. And he's like, oh, I like that. And so he calls her and he sleeps with her. But her husband is fighting on the front lines for him. And her husband comes home and he's like, oh, this is a problem. So he tries to put her husband even more on the front lines so that he dies.
Please die.
And then he dies, right? And so he's like purposefully like micromanaging the death of this woman's husband so that he can basically, because she becomes pregnant and that's problematic because her husband's, he brings him back from war and wants her husband to sleep with her so that he might think that he got her pregnant. And he's such a devotee of David that he won't go home. He sleeps in front of the palace gate. Because he's like, my comrades in arms, they're out on the battlefields, they're in the trenches.
His wife's getting knocked up by the king. Yeah, oh my God. Yeah.
So all that to say,
shit.
From a historian perspective, we look at this and we're like, hey, this is like the good guy. David's the good guy. He's
Allegedly.
The king, right? But he is a bit of a scumbag. Like he does these things. So we can look at that and we can say, especially within the ancient Near East, you never make the king look bad. So in this regard, that's probably true. These events probably took place because you look at all of the other ancient Near Eastern, the Mesopotamian, the Egyptian kings, the pharaohs, and they're always going above and beyond to try to make them look good. And so in the criterion of embarrassment, when you look at something like the Gospels, what's really interesting is, so it's sometimes, I like to refer to it as the disciples because they're like not getting anything Jesus is saying. Jesus is like, hey, I'm teaching you these things. And they're like, oh, okay. Like they continually fail to understand what Jesus is saying. He's predicting his own death. He's literally saying, I will be handed over to the authorities and will die. And then when it happens, they're like, we didn't see this coming. And then they abandon him.
Yeah.
And then Peter, who's like, number 2 to Jesus, right? He's the person who at the Last Supper says, I will die with you. I will fight for you.
He's like, I'm going to deny you. You're going to deny me 3 times?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he does it.
Yeah.
And so,
bad luck.
And what's interesting is that is particularly clear in the Gospel of Mark, which all the early eyewitness testimony dictates comes directly from Peter. So the Gospel of Mark portrays Peter kind of in the worst light. And if we're to trust the early source information, which I think we can, that's coming directly from Peter. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, looking at something like the criterion of embarrassment, this bodes well in that you would think that they would try to gloss over some of those things. That these people betrayed Jesus, that they denied Jesus, that they all ran away and they hid. Meanwhile, the women are like taking control. They're going to the tomb to.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with you that I think we really need to be careful of the fact that you have kind of mythological drift over time, and you need to be careful. However, there are criteria that we use as historians within the methodologies that we would look at any document to try to figure out, okay, how do we conclude, how do we make that, what I mentioned earlier, that inference to the best explanation, and weed out what is the reliable source information within this. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about the Gospels in particular is not only are they early, not only do they reflect eyewitness testimony, not only do individuals like Luke admit their blind spots and saying like, hey, don't confuse me for an eyewitness. I'm not an eyewitness, but I'm interviewing these eyewitnesses. And sometimes he names the people in a purposeful way to say like, hey, go ask.
You're right.
Go ask this person.
They're dead, but still ask them.
Well, they're alive at that point.
I'm kidding with
you. But so we have these kind of levels of credibility that exist within something of the Gospels that when I do historical analysis with someone like Cassio Dio or Tacitus or Plutarch, I'm using the same kind of criteria that I would with the Gospels to try to figure out, okay, what can I deem as credible and what can I deem as not credible? And interestingly enough, the Gospels have a very high inference of this because I think the authors are going over and above to communicate what we're talking about. You can place within a time and a specific location, and there are people involved. Here are the names of some of the people. Go talk to them. They're still around. And so I think there is, we do need to be careful of mythological drift or embellishment, which I think we do see in some of the other Gospels.
How so?
The non-biblical Gospels. We see aspects of shoehorning of particular beliefs. So
What do you mean shoehorning?
So Jesus, the historical Jesus, is a first century itinerant Jew.
Uh-huh.
The Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, Peter, Judas, portray Jesus not as a Jew, but as a pagan mystic.
A pagan mystic?
Yes.
Like pagan towards what Roman paganism believed at the time, or just like
to a certain degree, in the sense of, so you and I, previous to recording, were talking about what's sometimes referred to as substance dualism in the ancient world, where they believe that the physical world is bad and the spiritual world is good. So there were groups, like there was a group called the Docetics, or the Docetics. Dokein in Greek means to seem. So whereas some people today might have a problem with Jesus being God, in the ancient world, they didn't necessarily have that problem. They had a problem with him being man, like that he was a human was a problem. Because if Jesus is God, they're like, he can't be physical. Physical is bad. So they would strip that of him. And so this is particularly true in the Gospel of Peter, because the Gospel of Peter has a floating Jesus. He's a doketic Jesus. He's not actually there. And so in the instance of the crucifixion, Jesus is pretty chill because he's not even really being crucified. And so that is a pagan idea that comes from Platonic philosophy that is written onto Jesus. And so from a historical perspective, is it more likely that the biblical Gospels portray Jesus as a Jew when really he was a pagan? Or is it more likely that Jesus, living in first century Judea, growing up in Nazareth, living in Galilee, and traveling in these areas, was a pagan?
Right. So you're saying all of the non-biblical Gospels portray him as pagan?
They have some aspect of pagan theology which is
mean?
interwoven.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
So,
Just expand.
right, so the Gnostics. So part of Gnosticism, you might have heard that category before. So Gnostics were, Gnosticism as a kind of Eastern ideological concept comes from the East and predates Jesus. The problem with the overarching concept of Gnosticism is that there isn't one group called the Gnostics. That's a modern category. There were like dozens of groups that we now call the Gnostics. So in one sense, it's a little bit academically problematic to just call them Gnostics.
It's putting everything in one basket.
Yeah. Nonetheless, if we're going to paint with a very broad brush,
that's fine. Yeah.
The Gnostics, if we can boil down the essentials, even though they all disagree with each other and contradict one another on multiple levels, believe in gnosis. Gnosis in Greek means knowledge. And the idea is that you have these divine figures which are imparting secret knowledge to particular people. And so Jesus in the biblical Gospels is very public with his ministry. He's preaching in public. He's telling parables, which, mind you, can be a little bit cryptic at times. But his actual overt ministry is very public in that way. He's preaching to literally thousands of people. The opposite is true in the Gnostic Gospels. Jesus is kind of covert, and he's whispering something into this person's ear, and he's whispering something into that person's ear, and he's trying to keep the secret knowledge close, and he doesn't want it to be, out there and to the public, and it's cryptic to the point of being illegible. So you read something like the Gospel of Philip, and if you ever sit down and read the Gospel of Philip, you find it doesn't make any sense. In fact, I've translated through the Coptic of the Gospel of Philip from the Nag Hammadi library, and it's even hard to translate sometimes because the words seem like they don't fit. Like they say things and you're like, I don't know what this means. I don't understand. I'm translating it as it looks, but it's illegible. And that's on purpose. Because the idea is if you're enlightened, if you realize that it's not that Jesus is divine, but actually you're divine, and you realize your divinity, you unlock that by this gnosis, this secret knowledge. And so this is very different than what we see in either anything that resembles Judaism or anything that resembles what I would say is traced back to the historical Jesus. So it has these kinds of ideas that are more palatable for, say, a Roman pagan audience. They would have had no problem with these ideas. Whereas a lot of the things Jesus is saying are kind of antithetical to common understandings within broader Roman paganism.
All right, real quick, I just have to go to the bathroom, but I want to ask you how they're antithetical right when we get back. So let's put a pin in that. And I have you throughout the day today, so we're definitely, this is so interesting, man. You're doing a great job. We're definitely going to do a Patreon episode as well. So we'll do this, and then we'll have some more content there, and the Patreon link will be linked in description. But one sec, we'll be right back.
Yep.
All right, we're back. Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here